The room went silent when I said the words I had rehearsed for months. I can't wait for my raise. For a heartbeat, I let myself believe they would applaud, believe that my years of saving accounts, landing clients, and dragging Northbridge creative through firestorms had finally been noticed. Instead, the first sound I heard was laughter. Not from a stranger. Not from an enemy. From my husband. Colin leaned back in his leather chair at the head of the table, amusement flickering in his eyes as if I'd just delivered a punchline. Raise? Oh, Alicia. No. I gave it to Renee. The fluorescent lights overhead suddenly felt like spotlights, exposing every twitch of pity on the faces around me. Bethany from HR slid a folder across the table, her nails clicking twice on the cover before she pulled her hand back. You weren't even considered for the position, Alicia. The decision was finalized last week. The glass doors swung open and there she was, Renee Hart, in red heels I had once complimented, heels she had asked me if they were too much for the office. Perfect for making an impression, I had told her. And she had made one, just not the way I expected. She caught my eye and offered a small shrug. Forgot to mention it, she said breezily, settling into the seat across from me as if she'd earned it. The portfolio in my hands felt suddenly absurd. 8 months of data proving I had saved this company. Kestrel Robotics multimillion-dollar renewal. Blue Harbor Hotel's crisis I had contained before it hit headlines. Engagement figures that had tripled under my strategy. None of it mattered. None of it. I placed the folder on the table without opening it. My voice stayed steady. I see. Then I'll need the afternoon to transition my projects. Renee's smile widened, rehearsed confidence dripping from her tone. That won't be necessary. Colin's been bringing me up to speed for weeks. 4 weeks. While I had been preparing slides, whispering my pitch into the bathroom mirror, calculating how the raise could finally fund our long-delayed kitchen renovation, my husband had been training my replacement. He had listened to me rehearse at dinner. He had nodded, encouraging, as I fine-tuned charts. He had kissed me last night, made love to me, never once hinting that today would be my professional execution. I gathered my things with deliberate calm. The silence in the room pressed against me, heavy with awkwardness, but I refused to give them the spectacle of collapse. My heels clicked steadily against the floor as I walked out. At my desk, a cubicle tucked into a corner despite the fact that I had been running half the company's accounts, I pulled open drawers. The orchid I had kept alive through 2 winters. The mug Emma had given me, world's best multitasker. The framed photo from our company retreat, where I had been named Employee of the Quarter. Timothy, the junior analyst, appeared at my side holding a tablet. His eyes were wide with panic. Alicia, the Kestrel presentation needs final approval. Give it to Renee, I said simply, slipping the photo frame into my box. But she's never even met their team. She doesn't know the campaign. Then she'd better learn quickly. He froze, searching my face for anger, for tears, for some sign I was breaking. But there was nothing to give him. He didn't deserve my rage. He was too new to know that merit here was nothing but a costume. The drive home took 17 minutes. I counted each red light, each mile that stretched between me and the building where I had given everything and received nothing. Our house looked perfect from the outside. Tree-lined street, neat lawn, the picture of a successful couple. Inside, it felt like a stage where the play had already ended. I set the box on the dining table and saw, on Colin's desk, the Kestrel contract. The margins were filled with handwritten notes. But the handwriting wasn't Colin's sharp scrawl. It was Renee's looping curves. Notes stretching back 6 weeks. Notes about strategies I had built, contacts I had cultivated, clients I had fought to keep. My phone buzzed. A text from my daughter. How did the meeting go, Mom? Did you get it? I stared at the words, at the promises we had made about paying tuition and supporting her dreams. At my dreams, dismantled under my nose. I opened my laptop. Not the slide deck, not the campaign notes. A new document. At the top, I typed passwords, accounts, systems, every access point I had created. Every client relationship that lived in my hands, not in Colin's, not in Renee's. They thought they had ended me with a laugh. What they didn't know was that they had lit a fuse. And I intended to let it burn. At home, the walls seemed too quiet. Silence in a marriage is louder than shouting. I placed the box on the dining table, the mug and the orchid staring back at me like artifacts from a life I had just buried. Colin came in late, tie loosened, the familiar clink of his keys in the bowl by the door. Once that sound had meant safety. Tonight, it was punctuation and ending. He opened a beer and leaned against the counter as if the day had been nothing more than routine. "Alicia, we talked about this," he said casually, foam rising at the lip of the bottle. "Promoting your wife would look terrible. Optics matter. It's not personal." I watched him. Really watched him. The way you study a stranger on the street. Renee doesn't know the clients. She doesn't know the systems. She barely understands the language of strategy. And yet you think she's fit to lead. "She's learning," he shrugged. "And she doesn't come with the complications you do." The words dropped between us like broken glass. Complications. That's what my work, my voice, my presence had become to him. I almost laughed. It came out sharp, bitter. "The only thing you've protected me from, Colin, is credit and truth." He didn't flinch. He took another sip. "You're overreacting. It's just business." No, I thought. It was never just business. Not when you built it on my back. Not when you used my skills in the boardroom and my silence in the bedroom. I went upstairs without another word. Pulled down the suitcase from our honeymoon. Maui, years ago. The faded luggage tag still read Paradise Found. I unzipped it slowly, as if acknowledging that paradise had ended the moment I stopped being useful to him. When I returned to the dining table, my laptop glowed in the dark. I didn't open the company files. Not anymore. Instead, I began a new document. Passwords. Accounts. Systems. Line after line, I recorded what only I knew. The logins that ran beneath the surface. The workflows that made executives look efficient. The client hierarchies I had cultivated with careful trust. Secrets dressed as numbers. Invisible threads holding Northbridge together. If Colin thought I was disposable, he had forgotten the truth. I was the one holding the map. And now the map was mine alone. Upstairs, I slid my wedding ring off and set it on the dresser. Underneath, the skin was pale, tender, almost new. A mark of something finished. They thought they had humiliated me. But humiliation hardens into something sharper. That night, staring at the screen's glow, I knew. If Colin had lit the match, I would decide how long, how wide, and how far the fire would spread. And it would burn exactly where it needed to. The morning after felt different. Not because the sun rose any brighter, but because I woke up knowing something had shifted inside me. The woman who had walked out of that boardroom was not the same woman who had packed her orchid and her mug into a cardboard box. Something in me had calcified overnight, hardened into a clarity I could almost taste. I brewed coffee for one, ignoring the second cup I had poured for a decade. The silence of the house was no longer oppressive. It was instructive. Silence gives you space to think, and thinking is dangerous when you've been underestimated. On the table sat my laptop, still open to the file I had begun. Passwords. Accounts. Systems. It was more than a document now. It was a map of hidden veins, the circulatory system of Northbridge that only I had drawn. They thought Renee could step into my place because they believed work was what you presented in meetings. But true work was invisible, buried in workflows, client trust, relationships that had taken years to build and seconds to lose. But I needed more than systems. I needed proof. Evidence. Receipts. That's when I made the calls. First was Rebecca Chu, former finance director. She had left abruptly last year, her resignation buried under a vague family health reasons email. But I remembered her eyes on the day she packed her office, sharp, unsettled, unwilling to meet mine for too long. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Alicia? It's been a while." "It has," I said. "And I wish I were calling just to catch up. But I think you know why I'm not." Silence hummed for a beat, then she sighed. "Let me guess. Renee." "And Colin," I added quietly. Rebecca didn't laugh, but I could hear the bitter smile in her voice. "I should have known it would come to you eventually. I have files, expense reports, anomalies I flagged that never went anywhere. Personal charges on company accounts. Trips that looked like business but weren't. I saved everything. Would you be willing to meet? I asked. Yes, she said without hesitation. I'd like to see them burn too. Next, I called Jennifer Lee, once our head of PR. She had been the one to smooth over crises, a magician with words until she herself became a headline in whispers, creative differences, the official reason for her exit. She laughed without humor when she heard my voice. I knew Colin would cut you loose eventually. He likes the stage too much to share the spotlight. I need documents, I told her. Proof of what he and Renee have been doing. I kept the drafts, she said. Every press release I wrote that was altered to protect them, every deleted email I backed up before they thought to erase it. You'll want to see them. And then there was Sandra Patel, our operations manager. The one who had always kept the machinery of the company turning until suddenly she was gone, leaving behind a terse goodbye note. Sandra's voice on the line was sharper than the others, more cautious. Alicia, why now? Because they think they've won, I answered. And because I refused to let them. There was silence on the other end. Then she said, I have invoices. Contracts that were rerouted. Payments that don't line up with approved budgets. They made me sign off, but I saved the originals. By the end of the day, I had 3 meetings scheduled in 3 different coffee shops across the city. 3 women who had been dismissed, diminished, erased. 3 women who, like me, had chosen silence once but regretted it. The first meeting was with Rebecca. She slid a slim USB drive across the table as casually as if it were a sugar packet. Expense reports, she said. Trips labeled as client meetings. Hotel stays that never included clients. Dinners where the receipts read like date nights. Renee? I asked. Her lips tightened. Always. But sometimes others too. Colin was careful about the names, but not careful enough. I pocketed the drive, feeling its weight like a stone. With Jennifer, it was folders, physical, heavy printed. She had scribbled notes in the margins. Look here, she said, tapping one line. They rewrote this crisis statement to erase Renee's misstep. And here, they turned my draft into something that praised Colin as a savior. Every narrative bent to them. Every mistake vanished. And Sandra, pragmatic as always, handed me a notebook. Handwritten, meticulous. These are the real contracts. Compare them to the versions they filed. You'll see the money trails. You'll see where it went. I flipped through pages covered in neat ink lines, numbers aligned like soldiers. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just favoritism. This was fraud. By the time I returned home that night, the box on my dining table no longer looked like remnants of a career. It looked like evidence. I spread the files across the surface. Receipts, statements, contracts, reports. Together, they formed a mosaic of betrayal so wide it almost staggered me. This wasn't just about me losing a promotion. It wasn't even about Renee stealing my place. It was about an entire structure built on lies, propped up by Colin's arrogance and Renee's ambition. I stood over the table, staring at the chaos of paper and ink, and felt something I hadn't allowed myself in weeks. Not grief. Not even rage. Purpose. They thought they had silenced me. What they didn't know was that silence has teeth when you decide to bite. And I was done swallowing. Morning light cut through the blinds like interrogation lines. I hadn't slept much, not because of fear, but because my mind had been sprinting too fast to rest. The table in front of me looked like a crime board. Folders, drives, handwritten notes, receipts, all threads of a story that nobody wanted to admit but everybody needed to see. Colin had underestimated me in one fatal way. He thought humiliation would keep me quiet. He forgot that humiliation is a fuel, and I had gallons of it. I brewed coffee, steadying my hands around the mug, and drafted the email that would be my first strike. Not a scream. Not an accusation. A scalpel. Subject: clarifications needed on financial irregularities. To Board of Directors, Northbridge Creative. I wrote like a strategist, not a scorned wife. I attached files with polite labels, expense variance reports, contract revisions, crisis statement drafts. My words were measured. Certain inconsistencies have surfaced regarding project leadership, client communications, and fiscal responsibility. I have attached preliminary documentation for your review. Please advise on next steps. No anger. No exclamation marks. Just enough to plant a doubt that would grow into panic. By 9 a.m., I saw the first ripples. Calls delayed. Assistants pacing hallways. The usual rhythm of Northbridge. Phones buzzing. Meetings clicking forward. Fell into strange silence. The kind of silence that signals fear. Colin called me once. Then again. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail that was too calm to be real. Alicia, I think you're overreacting. Let's talk about this at home. Home. The same word he had hollowed out long before the boardroom had finished the job. But I wasn't finished. That afternoon, I opened LinkedIn. My fingers hovered. Then I typed the title, When Merit Meets Politics. I wrote not about Colin or Renee by name, but about what happens when companies choose favoritism over results. I detailed how talent gets buried, how leaders protect optics over outcomes, how politics strangle progress. It wasn't bitter. It was surgical. I wrote like someone dissecting a corpse. Then I pressed publish. The response was immediate. By the end of the day, my post had hundreds of reactions, comments piling in. This happened to me at my last job. I gave 10 years to a company only to be replaced by a CEO's nephew. Merit means nothing if leadership can't recognize it. Voices of the ignored rose into a chorus. And in that noise, my own story gained shape. But the part one hadn't expected was the message requests. Robert Keane, CEO of Kestrel Robotics. We renewed with Northbridge because of you. We want continuity. Would you consider consulting directly? Then came Blue Harbor Hotels. Argent Labs. Names that made up the spine of Northbridge's portfolio. All asking the same question. Can we work with you instead? By the end of the week, I had 3 offers on the table. Not pity offers. Not let us help you. They were business, clear and sharp. Contracts in my name, not as someone's wife, not as a silent strategist, but as Alicia Reed. And then came the call from Orion and Field, Northbridge's fiercest competitor. Marcus Lyon himself. His tone was smooth, deliberate. We've been following this situation. We want you to join us. Director level with equity. Bring just 2 of your accounts, and in 6 months you'll be vice president. I didn't even hesitate. Send me the contract. When I hung up, I stood at the window, watching the city's rain smear the skyline into gray watercolor. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was on the outside looking in. I was the one moving pieces now. Meanwhile, inside Northbridge, the walls were cracking. Renee had stepped into my accounts with rehearsed charm, but charm collapses under numbers. She fumbled client questions, misquoted strategies, promised results she couldn't deliver. The board, already rattled by my email, began to see the fractures. I received a message from Timothy late one evening. They're scrambling. Renee told the team Kestrel was under control, but the client just called demanding you. Everyone's whispering. I almost pitied her. Almost. But then I remembered the red heels tapping across the boardroom floor, the shrug, the smug smile. No, pity was wasted here. Colin tried to reach me again. This time in text. You don't have to do this. We can fix it. I stared at the words until they blurred, then typed one reply. You broke it. That night, I spread the receipts, the folders, the notebooks across my table again. Each piece was a shard, sharp and undeniable. Together, they formed a mirror. And in that mirror was a truth Colin couldn't spin, a story Renee couldn't rebrand. I wasn't the woman waiting for recognition anymore. I wasn't the strategist in the shadows. I was the fire they had lit. And now it was daylight. The house looked the same from the outside. Perfectly trimmed hedges, a neat lawn, the porch light glowing like a beacon of stability. But when I stepped inside, box still in my arms, it no longer felt like home. It felt like a stage set after the actors had left, props in place but no life behind them. I set the box on the dining table. The orchid's leaves trembled in the shift of air, fragile but alive, like me. Colin's office door stood open down the hall. On his desk, the Kestrel contract still lay where I had seen it days ago, Renee's loops of handwriting curling across the margins. I stared at them for a long moment before turning away. The front door clicked open an hour later. Colin walked in with his usual casual confidence, loosening his tie, dropping his keys into the ceramic bowl with that familiar clink. A sound that had once comforted me now made my stomach tighten. He popped open a beer on the counter edge, ignoring the damp ring it left behind. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady. He sighed like a man burdened by a wife's nagging. "Alicia, I told you. Promoting you would have looked bad. Favoritism, nepotism, optics matter. It wasn't personal." "Not personal." My laugh was soft, sharp. "Colin, you gave my work to your mistress." He froze for half a second, then recovered. "Renee is qualified. She's learning quickly. And she doesn't come with the complications you do." That word again. Complications. My blood ran cold. Complications? You mean experience? Results? Or the fact that I've been here long enough to see the cracks in your stories? He took a long drink instead of answering. The silence stretched. I could hear the fizz of his beer more than his voice. Then he finally spoke. "You're being dramatic. It's just a job." "No," I said. "It's a job. And a marriage. And one of those I can resign from tonight." For the first time in a long time, his composure faltered. He set the bottle down too hard, the glass clinking against the counter. "Don't threaten me, Alicia." "I'm not threatening. I'm deciding." The air between us went thick, charged. And then the doorbell rang. I didn't move. Neither did he. But after a beat, Colin walked to the door and opened it. Red heels crossed the threshold before I even saw her face. Renee, polished, smiling faintly as if she belonged there. She carried a slim laptop under her arm. "Sorry to drop by so late, Colin. I finished the draft for the Kestrel update. Thought you'd want to see it tonight." Her eyes flicked to me standing by the dining table. She didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled brighter, like a performer hitting her cue. I stared at Colin. "You couldn't wait until the morning?" He had the audacity to shrug. "This is business." Renee placed the laptop on his desk as though she had done it 100 times. "It won't take long," she said sweetly. The air in the house shifted, heavy and wrong. Everything I had tried to ignore snapped into focus. The late nights, the whispered calls, the handwriting on contracts. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't paranoia. This was betrayal written in red heels on my hardwood floor. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I walked to the closet, pulled down the suitcase from our honeymoon, and placed it on the bed. The zipper sounded like a verdict. Colin followed me, his voice low but urgent. "You're overreacting. You're not leaving over this." I folded blouses into the suitcase, calm and precise. "I'm leaving because this house is an echo chamber. My words, my work, my worth, everything bounces back distorted. And I'm done listening." "You can't just walk out," he snapped. "I can," I said. "And I am." Renee's laughter floated faintly from the office, the sound of someone who thought she'd won. I closed the suitcase and straightened. At the dresser, I slid my wedding ring off and set it beside a faded conference badge with my name printed bold, Alicia Reed. Two objects side by side, one that had caged me, one that had defined me. I picked up the badge and left the ring behind. When I wheeled the suitcase to the door, Colin stood there, arms crossed, jaw tight. But he didn't block me. He didn't say stay. He just let me go. Outside the night was cool. The street was quiet. And for the first time in years, the silence wasn't oppressive. It was freedom. I slid into the back of a waiting cab, the suitcase beside me, the city lights stretching ahead like an open map. Renee thought she had claimed victory by taking my place. Colin thought he had silenced me by dismissing me. But they had both forgotten the simplest rule. The woman who walks away with nothing to lose is the woman they should fear most. And I was already planning where the fire would spread next. Orion and Field's tower gleamed like a blade cutting into the Portland skyline. I had walked into plenty of lobbies in my career, but that first morning, as the glass doors sighed open and I stepped inside, I felt something I hadn't in years: possibility. The receptionist smiled and handed me a badge. Alicia Reed, Director of Strategic Accounts. Just my name. Not someone's wife. Not an afterthought. My office sat high enough that Mount Hood filled the horizon on clear days. The space smelled of new paint and leather, untainted by old betrayals. On my desk waited a folder from Marcus Ellison, Orion's CEO. 3 accounts we'd like you to approach, his note read. Land even one, and the rest of the division will follow your lead. I smiled. He didn't need to say the names. They were written like destiny. Kestrel Robotics, Blue Harbor Hotels, Sterling Communications. The very clients Colin and Renee had dangled as proof of success. The lifeblood of Northbridge Creative. I worked like a surgeon those first weeks. Precise, tireless. Calls at dawn, flights squeezed between meetings. Decks built in the quiet hours when the city slept. But this time, it wasn't desperation driving me. It was clarity. I no longer needed to prove myself to a man who had already decided I was a complication. I needed only to prove myself to me. The clients followed quickly, almost eagerly. Campbell, the CEO of Kestrel, told me flat out, "We stayed with Northbridge because of you. Without you, there's no reason." Blue Harbor signed on within days, citing my crisis management as the reason they trusted me with their brand. Sterling's board chair called me the only strategist who actually listens. By the end of the quarter, all 3 accounts had transitioned. My department's numbers surged. Employee morale skyrocketed. For the first time in years, the late nights didn't feel like theft. They felt like building. Meanwhile, whispers about Northbridge spread like cracks in old plaster. Renee had been promoted with fanfare, but her speeches were shallow, her campaigns recycled. Clients noticed. Investors noticed. Even employees noticed. Timothy reached out to me one evening over email. "They're unraveling without you. Morale is at rock bottom. Renee's panicking. Colin looks like he hasn't slept in weeks." I read the message, then closed my laptop. Sympathy wasn't what I felt. It was something colder. Recognition that the collapse I had been forced into was now theirs. By month 3, Northbridge's biggest clients had all left. Revenues dipped. Staff turnover spiked. And then came the news that tasted like poetic justice. Northbridge was exploring strategic acquisition opportunities. In other words, they were looking for a buyer. Marcus summoned me to his office one Friday afternoon. The skyline glowed behind him, pink and gold. He slid a file across the desk. "Northbridge," he said simply. I opened it. Financial statements bleeding red ink. A list of accounts shrinking like a tide going out. Board minutes filled with desperate half-measures. At the bottom, one sentence. Potential buyer Orion and Field. I laughed. Quiet. Sharp. Disbelieving. The company that had dismissed me was now at our mercy. Marcus's smile was thin. "I want you to lead the acquisition team. No one knows their systems like you do." A week later, I walked into the same conference room where Colin had humiliated me. Same mahogany table. Same leather chairs. But the weight in the air had shifted. This time, I wasn't the one carrying a portfolio begging to be noticed. I was the one holding the pen that could decide their fate. Colin sat at the head of the table still, but he looked smaller. Shoulders slumped. Jaw tight. His hair grayer than I remembered. Renee was beside him, red heels still on, but the shine had dulled. Her eyes darted anywhere but mine. I placed Orion's folder on the table with deliberate calm. "The terms," I began, "are straightforward. Orion will absorb Northbridge's remaining profitable accounts. Contracts will be honored, but under new management. Several positions will be deemed redundant." I slid 2 envelopes across the table. The first bore Renee's name. The second Colin's. "Redundant," I repeated softly. Colin's hand twitched. He didn't open his envelope. Renee did. Her face drained of color as she read. "You can't do this," Colin said finally, his voice cracking. I leaned forward just enough to let the words land. I already did. The silence that followed wasn't pity this time. It was power. Mine. For years, Colin had laughed at me across this very table. Today, no one laughed. The signatures went down one by one. Lawyers, board members, Orion's representatives. When the meeting adjourned, Northbridge no longer belonged to Colin. It belonged to us. I stood, gathered my folder, and looked at him one last time. "You said it was just a job. Now it's just not yours." As I walked out, my heels clicked against the tile, not with defeat this time, but with the sound of reclamation. And I knew this was only the beginning. My new apartment didn't have much. 2 rooms, sun that found the floor in the mornings, and a view of the city that felt like permission. I unpacked slowly, choosing what deserved space. The awards call-in once called clutter. The photo from the retreat where I had been named Employee of the Quarter, this time with Renee cropped out. The orchid, still stubbornly alive. On my desk sat a simple nameplate, Alicia Reed, Vice President, Orion and Field. Just my name. No asterisks. No footnotes. Work moved like a tide that finally knew its shore. The division grew. People stayed late because they wanted to, not because they were afraid. Credit flowed in the right direction. When someone had an idea, the room made space for it. When a junior analyst solved a problem I couldn't, I said so, out loud, in front of everyone. The culture changed because we guarded the door and asked one question before anyone walked through. Will you make this a place where talent breathes? Word of the acquisition spread further than I expected. My inbox filled with messages from strangers who weren't strangers anymore, women and men who recognized the shape of what had happened to me because it had happened to them. They didn't want a hero. They wanted a blueprint. So I wrote one. I turned my LinkedIn post into a talk, then the talk into a workshop. Merit only, politics nowhere. It wasn't inspirational fluff. It was process. How to measure outcomes, not noise. How to build review systems that can't be gamed. How to keep credit attached to the hands that earned it. I taught teams how to document everything, not for revenge, but for truth. The keynote invite came after that. The Pacific Northwest Marketing Summit. I said yes without thinking about who might sit in the audience. Backstage, the carpet swallowed sound. I reviewed my notes, then didn't need them. Some stories live in the body. The stage manager lifted 2 fingers. I walked into light. 2 years ago, I believed hard work spoke for itself. I believed results were louder than politics. I believed the people closest to me would champion my success. A pause. I was wrong. The room leaned forward. What I learned is simpler and harder. Meritocracy isn't a state, it's a system. It needs guardrails. It needs accountability. It needs leaders who refuse shortcuts, even when they benefit from them. If you are in power, your first job is to make sure talent doesn't need permission to be seen. I didn't say Colin's name. I didn't need to. The example stood without labels. A company that had mistaken charm for competence, optics for ethics, and familiarity for value. A company that had been bought because it wouldn't buy the truth. When the lights softened, people stood. The applause felt less like victory than recognition. On my way off stage, I glanced into the crowd and saw him. Back row, smaller than memory. He didn't wave. Neither did I. Shared history is not the same thing as current relevance. Afterward, a young woman waited until the line thinned. Her blazer was a little too big, the way new armor always is. I'm Grace, she said, voice steady and tired all at once. My manager keeps presenting my work as his own. HR told me to be a team player. I don't know what to do. Tell me everything, I said, and she did. The details changed. The pattern did not. I gave her 2 things. A framework to document outcomes that couldn't be erased, and a card with my direct line. Sometimes the bravest move isn't climbing a broken ladder, I said. It's choosing a different building. She looked at the card like it weighed more than paper. Thank you. On the sidewalk outside the venue, evening lifted the city into gold. I walked without rushing. The air tasted new. Northbridge dissolved quietly after the acquisition. Leases renegotiated, teams rehomed. A few good people offered roles at Orion and Field, the rest given soft landings and real references. The logo came down on a Tuesday. No ceremony. Just a sign lowered by men on a lift. I watched from across the street and felt exactly what the moment required. Nothing more than closure. Colin sent 1 email. The subject line was my name. Inside, 3 sentences. An apology that arrived without specifics. An offer to talk. A line about how we'd once been a team. I archived it without replying. Sometimes silence is the only accurate response. Renee vanished the way borrowed light does. Bright until the source moves on. Industry gossip placed her in smaller agencies. Short stints, longer gaps. I didn't follow. Not out of kindness. Out of discipline. The opposite of revenge is not forgiveness. It's focus. At Orion and Field, we opened a mentorship program and named it Visible. Not cute, not coy. Direct. Every quarter, 5 early career strategists got resources, a sponsor with authority, and one rule that sat in our handbook in bold: your work will be attributed to you in writing. By the end of the year, retention in my division hit 97%. Our revenue tripled. More importantly, hallway conversations changed. Less whispering, more building. At home, my world rearranged itself into something honest. My daughter drove up one weekend with too many groceries and a look that asked if I was okay without asking out loud. We ate on the floor among unpacked boxes and argued about movies and laughed until we forgot to clean up. She told me she'd added read back to her email signature at school. I didn't tell her I cried later, quietly, grateful that names can be repaired. On a clear morning not long after, the orchid bloomed. 3 white flowers like small, stubborn flags. I moved it to the window and thought about all the things that survive neglect when they finally find light. The last piece fell into place at a board meeting that looked nothing like the ones I used to endure. No posturing. No fog. Just a table of people arguing about the right things. Outcomes, ethics, impact. Marcus turned to me near the end and said, "We're adding a new seat. If you want it, it's yours." I did. Not for the title. For the leverage. Influence without values is theater. Influence with values is infrastructure. Months later, at a smaller conference, I saw Colin again. He was registering late, card failing, patience thinner than his tie. I could have looked away. I didn't. I paid his fee with my corporate card and told the attendant to put it under professional courtesy. When he turned, embarrassed gratitude half-formed on his face, I said, "Good luck," and meant it. You can carry anger like armor, but it rusts. I prefer clean lines. On the night we launched Visible publicly, the team gathered in our conference space, a room of glass and light with a view that made ambitions feel reasonable. We announced our first cohort, told their stories, attached their names to their work. Cameras flashed. Applause rose. A junior strategist whispered, half to herself, "I didn't know it could be like this." It can. If we build it that way. If we guard it. Back in my apartment, I opened the drawer where I had placed my wedding ring months ago. It lay there quietly, irrelevant. I lifted it once, felt nothing I needed to keep, and set it back down. Some relics belong to the Museum of Lessons Learned. On my desk, a new card waited to be signed. Chief Marketing Officer. I thought of the box I had carried out of Northbridge, the mug, the orchid, the photo. At the time, it had felt like loss. Now I could see it for what it was, the inventory of what mattered and what didn't. The things you choose to take when you decide you deserve better. I turned off the lamp and stood by the window. The city was a scatter of stars at ground level. Somewhere out there, a younger version of me sat at a kitchen table, listing passwords and systems, turning humiliation into fuel. I wanted to tell her something simple. You were never the complication. You were the engine. The phoenix metaphors people like to use aren't quite right. You don't burn and then magically rise. You sift the ash for what's still true, you keep the parts that survived, and you build something that doesn't need fire to stand. I closed the curtains, let the room go dark, and felt the quiet settle, solid, earned mine. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new rooms, new tables. I would choose them carefully. The laugh that tried to end me had become a footnote. The headline belonged to my name.